So we now have about 10 minutes for some Q&A, and they can be directed to individuals or to all three at once. So I'm going to kick us off with a question to all three, but don't feel like your questions have to be directed to all of them if you have one specifically. I want to know, so each of you are working within violence and healing, and that is emotionally taxing work. So I want to know really quickly where you find your source of strength and inspiration from. John, do you want to start?
I find sharing MJ's story, promoting peace building, promoting peace in Congo to be therapeutic. And of course, my main source comes from Michelle at home.
Now it's my turn. Where do you find
your source of strength and inspiration in this emotionally charged space?
Well, I decided to create a home to do my work out of so that I could continually be fulfilled and poured back into in the very space where I'm pouring out. So I really don't do things that don't pour back into me anymore. It's more of like creating mutual exchange scenarios instead of empty cup, filled cup, empty cup, filled cup.
I have to learn from that. I think it's really building the community and learning, finding people that feed you and keep you normal and grounded, and humor and music and food.
And Sam. Are there other questions from the audience? I can run up to you with this mic, or you can shout them out and then I can repeat them. And I know a lot of familiar faces, so if someone doesn't speak up, I'm going to call on someone.
We did just throw a lot at them in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to move? That's my question.
You mean physically?
Like physically? I would love to stretch. Thank you.
Yes.
Very much.
Definitely a good role.
I forget who used the term intergenerational trauma, I think, and I just wanted to hear more specifically what that means.
Yeah, I did that. And, well, so we commonly understand trauma as being something that happens on the individual level, like in our bodies, when we experience something in our lifetime. But thank you, CJP. I was able to learn about and understand about trauma that is kind of beyond that individual scope. So speaking personally, coming from a group of people who have been formerly colonized. So this kind of shared experience of colonization, I've never personally lived in my lifetime, but my ancestors have lived. And that kind of an experience actually can impact how we see ourselves. It can break connections within our own selves, trusting ourselves, our self-image, understanding, even how we understand ourselves spiritually as connected beings versus disconnected beings. And then how that affects how we interact with other people in our communities too, so the social aspect as well. And there's studies that show that the DNA is actually changed and shifted through like major traumagenic periods such as genocide, enslavement, war, things like that. And so actually on the cellular level, DNA gets shifted and that gets passed down generationally. But also that shows elasticity of our brain, so that means there can be intergenerational healing as well as intergenerational trauma.
Yes, all the way in the back.
This question's for John, and I hesitate to ask it because it's fairly personal, and so if you would rather not address it, or that is fine. I'm guessing that you were aware the kind of work MJ was doing was inherently dangerous, and it made me wonder what kind of conversations you might have had with him prior to his death about the possibility of his death.
So the question was, for anyone that couldn't hear it, that the work that MJ was involved with overseas was inherently dangerous, and he's wondering if there were conversations in advance that he would have had any insight.
Indeed, but Michelle, do you want to respond to that?
At one point, well, first of all, when your child's passion and mission is to help people in conflict and in violent areas of conflict, you know that there can be danger, physical danger. But when you see that that's a passion and they have gifts that, you know, not everyone has, you want to support that. And so we recognize that there is danger in that. But I have to admit, when he was younger, and he had a very keen mind, and he was always inquisitive and very adventurous, but he would be interested in something, and he would master it so quickly and then get bored. And I prayed, literally prayed, God, help him to find something that he won't be bored with in 2 weeks. You know, will he ever find anything in life that will be fulfilling and continue to be challenging? So I literally prayed about that. And when he found something that he really found challenging and really put himself into, you don't go, now God, change it. You know what I'm saying? And it was so obvious that he had such a passion, and he was so good at it. So the one thing at one point he said to me, just sort of out of the blue, I was in the living room and he walked in and he said, Mom, you know I don't have a death wish. That's not why I do this work. And I said, sure, I know that. He said, but I do carry a burden, and that is the pain I would cause my family if anything happened to me. And I said, well, MJ, you know that would be something we have to deal with. I don't want you to carry that. We want you to feel celebrated in the gifts that you have and in the passion that you have. And I said, do you feel our support? And he says, oh yeah, I do. And that's what we wanted to hear. So we lived with that understanding, but we refused to live in fear. We wanted to celebrate his gifts, and we wanted to celebrate how God was going to use him. And we chose consciously not to live in fear.
Yes, Christy.
I have a question for Tammy. Talking about the both and approach, you know, kind of acknowledging that there is suffering and there also needs to be a way forward, or, you know, kind of however you frame that within a situation. And talking, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the difficulties that come around, maybe if those things don't feel equivalent, that someone may feel like their pain actually needs to be primary and it can't be moved past yet, or that and is like when does it become difficult to do both and if one half of that is challenging the other?
Oh, very good question. It's very difficult, and it's not for, I think very early on I learned that it's not for me to judge or assess, because it's not my suffering and it's not my situation. And I think I was very fortunate in that very first case, in Tim McVeigh's case, to learn that I'm not an expert, and that everybody else in their suffering, they're the experts, and I am simply sometimes the listener, and by listening sometimes I hear them say things that maybe they're not necessarily hearing themselves. And at appropriate times, sometimes you're able to feed that back to people. Like at moments I'm able to say, I wonder if, I've heard you say, I wonder if, and people will stop in their tracks and say, well, when did I say that? And so sometimes I think being from the outside and being an intermediary in ways in which the suffering isn't mine, I'm able to see more clearly a path that they're directing themselves to, but I can only do that when they're ready to hear it. And I mean, when they hear, they're waiting to hear it because they'll start to say things. But sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when people don't want to let go and that they really want to hold on to that pain. And it is my job to not judge it and to let them hold on to it, because people will only let go when they're ready. And I think that's been probably the thing that I carry with me the most in my work, is I carry the stories with me of people who, they're haunted. They're haunted by unfinished business or unfinished conversations. And that's what they carry with them.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Hello, and this is for Tammy and the Sharps. I come from Tallahassee, where we're kind of famous for two women who reached out to their daughter's killers. And perhaps that was one that you were referring to, Tammy, I don't know. But in both cases, they've now made an international film, but the French made the film, Another Justice. You can Google it. But here's the thing that was significant to me. Agnes Fury, who is one of those women, she said, I don't use the word forgiveness with other victims. It's a misunderstood term. And she said, my effort is to understand. She wanted to reach out to her daughter's killer to understand. When she reached out to that man, she was actually prevented because he was an African American behind bars. He was the perpetrator of her daughter's killer, and the Department of Corrections prevented her from talking to him. And when she finally, through letters, he just sobs. In that movie, Another Justice, it's about restorative justice, just sobs that this woman would reach out to him because he is living in such a dark place, and it's offering such a great breakthrough for him.
Thank you for sharing that story. And was your question about, do I know those women, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question really is how okay, when you who are working in restorative justice, all of you who are working in restorative justice, and you have an us-them situation, and you asked us to think about both and. But so often the us-them situation is perpetrators versus victims, and it requires such a leap, and I would imagine especially in the 9/11 attacks. How can we actually frame this conversation in a way that it promotes, is it difficult to use forgiveness, or is it better to try to come in maybe through the side door of understanding? I don't know. Question.
Most of the family members that I've ever worked with refer to forgiveness as the F word. So I don't ever use the word forgiveness, and I also don't use the word closure, because I think that other people could talk much more about that than I can. I think that understanding is really that human connection that I was trying to talk about, but I also heard from Darsheel. I think it is our human nature to try and understand. And I think that when horrible things happen, when there are horrendous acts, we may have so many layers of frustration or anger or just true raw anger at what has happened. But when I think that person's anger is honored and it is listened to, and it isn't being trying to justify, well, if you only understood that he was an abuse, you know, like, and I'm not trying to diminish their abuse, but also, you know what I mean? It's just, you can't, I think from a family member's perspective, it's only when that person's pain and suffering is validated can they actually begin to feel something outside of that. And what my experience has been is that family members then try to make sense of the senselessness, and that goes to the understanding. Help me understand how you could get from here to here. And sometimes it's the really gruesome minutia details that we think we want to shield family member from because of the pain. Like we think that it's so atrocious. But really by shielding family members from the pain when they're asking for it, what we're doing is denying them the opportunity to make sense of the senselessness. And I'm just going to pass it over because I think it's really something you can.
MJ believed in the both and. He had a non-dichotomous view of the world. He believed there was hope in every human being. So I carry that on. I know that our destinies are intertwined with people we may call the enemy or the bad people, but we're not 100% good and they're not 100% bad. So I try to understand humanity with that perspective. And we're not sure justice, as they call it, legal justice will ever be done. We decided early on not to pin our hopes and well-being to the trial, multiple trials in the DRC. But we get reports from the chief negotiator, chief investigator, and they've recently indicted a mid-level military man for the murders. So things are beginning to happen, but it could still be 2 years before anything happens. And then what do we want? What do we want? We want accountability. We want that stopped. But we also want shalom justice, where everyone has what he or she needs, and people can have enough food and live in peace.
What an incredibly powerful hour that we have all spent together. In closing, I would like to ask each of you to answer the question of what is the one thing that you want us to take away from in the last 60 minutes that we spent together. Darsheel, let's start with you.
That's a big question. I think that, which is kind of like the last couple of lines of my talk, of that we always have the power to choose, and the power of the mind is somewhere that we can always go when things around us in our external environment don't seem as expansive in the moment. And so just reminding ourselves of that unlimited potential that we have within us, to always shift something inside of us to show up a little bit differently.
Tammy?
Find a way to be in community with people in trying to hold that both and. It's harder on a day-to-day basis than I can do most days myself.
I hope you leave with the understanding that peace building is everyone's work. And I'm so delighted when, after I'm speaking somewhere, a teenager or a youth will come forward and say, I want to do that kind of work, which happened to me not long ago. A 14-year-old stood up and said, that's the kind of work I want to do. That's the kind of difference I want to make. So peace is possible, peace building is possible, and it's everyone's work.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Go in peace.
Thank you.